Please remain muted until time for question and answers. And I will pass it over to Ellen Efros this morning, who will introduce our speaker and our presentation for today. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our live presentation this morning. I'm glad to see at least some of you have rejected your pajamas and come down to the Oak Room to hear Barbara in person. Our presenter today really needs no introduction. She has spoken so many times at ILR on so many different topics, and she is so well respected by our community that we are so pleased to have Barbara Oberlander with us this morning. Barbara is going to speak. I don't know if a lot of you know this, but in addition to everything else that goes on in March, March is also Women's Month. And Barbara is going to do a talk on a particular woman who was a spy during World War II and was one of the most dangerous spies for the United States and the British Secret Service that you can imagine. Her name was Virginia Hall, and she grew up as a Baltimore socialite, but she rejected that life and she became a spy for the British Secret Service. And Barbara's presentation is going to focus on Virginia Hall. I would ask you to hold your questions, including those people on Zoom, until the end of Barbara's presentation. And I promise you, we will get to all of your questions. And with that, I turn the presentation over to Barbara.
Good morning, everyone. It's nice to be back at Okehamak and to see so many familiar faces. I think it's been about 2 years since I've been here. As Ellen said, March is Women's History Month, officially proclaimed by the President of the United States now for about 40 years. And it is my custom during Women's History Month to talk about a woman that perhaps I had not heard of before. And the story of how I came to do this presentation on Virginia Hall is really an interesting one. I have a friend, Kathy Martin, who is a voracious reader. And about 3 years ago, among her stack of books in her house, she said to me, I have just taken out of the library a book about a woman that's fascinating. Have you heard about her? And she told me the name Virginia Hall, and I had not heard about her. So being a good internet researcher, I looked her up very briefly. She sounds interesting. I started a file, put her name on it, put it away as I was doing many other projects. Then about a year ago, a friend of mine who works at the Friends of the Library, and you know they collect books for big book sales, said, I saw this book and I thought of you, so I bought it for you, and here it is. And it was a book about Virginia Hall. Simultaneously, I received a notice from the Holocaust Museum in Washington that there was going to be an interview with Virginia Hall's niece. And I said, wait a minute, I'm getting messages here. I need to really look into this woman. And what I found was, as Ellen said, a woman who was raised as a Baltimore socialite, who became a spy during World War II, was astonishing, incredible, brave, courageous, creative, and had virtually been ignored by historians and other writers for several decades. When you look at Virginia Hall, what you're going to see is a female James Bond, but in reality. Now, you might be thinking that there have been other women spies in American history, and that's absolutely true. You can go back, indeed, to the American Revolution and find somebody like Lydia Dara, who was a gentle Quaker woman whose house had been taken over by British soldiers, and she listened to their conversations. Then, with the excuse that she had to go mill some flour, she passed on that information to American troops. You come to the Civil War, and there's quite a collection of female spies. Here is Pauline Cushman, who was not only an actress, but a very active spy for the Union. There was somebody named Elizabeth Van Loo, who was a Richmond society matron. She presented herself as Crazy Bet and visited Union soldiers in prison and helped them escape. The most famous one was a Confederate spy, Rose O'Neill Greenhow, and she was a very well-known, very famous society hostess in Washington, and she relayed intelligence to Confederate leaders in code. She was eventually arrested and actually imprisoned in the old Capitol prison in Washington, D.C. But all of these women who I have talked about and admire pale in comparison, I have to say, to Virginia Hall. There's no one quite like her. And you have to realize that during World War II, the world of espionage and sabotage and spying was a very important part of the war effort. And it was a man's war effort. It was a male-dominated field. And along came this extraordinary woman. Virginia Hall was born to a very wealthy Baltimore family in 1906. Her father, pictured here, and here's Virginia with her older brother, John. Her father was a banker who had inherited a great deal of wealth from his father. And she was raised on this farm, Boxhorn Farm, where she hunted, rode horses, enjoyed being outside. She was extremely athletic from the very beginning, and she liked to challenge convention. To her mother's despair, she would often wear old plaid flannel shirts and pants, which was not something she was supposed to do. She attended Roland Park Country School in Baltimore, which is a very exclusive private girls' school. And there she earned a reputation. She called herself cantankerous and capricious, unquote. She liked to defy convention. She would hunt with her rifle. She would skin rabbits. She would ride horses bareback. And once she wore a bracelet of live snakes to school to amaze her classmates. She was a natural leader, loved adventure. She starred in several dramatic presentations. She was class president, editor-in-chief of her yearbook. Her nickname was Dindy, And everyone regarded her as, quote, the most original among us. Nope, I want to go back. This is the picture of her and the page from her high school graduation yearbook. And the quote under her name, "I must have liberty withal as large a charter as I please." And if you come down to the bottom, I know it's probably impossible to read, but one of the things her classmate has said about her was, she has been acclaimed the most original of our class, and she lives up to her reputation at all times. The one thing to expect from DEND is the unexpected. I love that quote because it's going to turn out to be absolutely true. After graduation from high school, she went briefly to both Radcliffe and Barnard, but she was bored. She dropped out. She not only dropped out of college, she then ditched her well-off fiancé to the horror of her mother because she was supposed to become part of Baltimore's social set, and she went off to Paris. Now, this is very important. She went to Paris at 20 years old. It was the 1920s. Paris was a place of freedom, of innovation, of art, of culture, of romance. Oh, she loved it. It was perfect for Virginia Hall. She found a freedom, she found a lover, she found the French people whom she adored. And this will be very important in the future. From Paris, where she studied political science, then she went to Vienna. And she studied languages, economics, journalism. These years were very important because she became proficient in 5 languages: French, German, Spanish, Italian, and Russian. She returned home in 1929, back to the United States, did graduate work briefly in economics and French at George Washington University, and then applied to the State Department. What she wanted to do was become a diplomat. Here she is at this time, and she applied to the State Department, but in the Foreign Service, there were 1,500 workers. Of those 1,500 Foreign Service people, six were women. That's 0.004%. To say there was gender discrimination in the State Department is an understatement. So she took a job as a clerk in the American Embassy in Warsaw, Poland in 1931, and this is her consulate photograph. By the way, Virginia Hall was tall, 5'7", auburn hair, very striking in appearance. I mean, people noticed her. Her salary was $2,000 a year, which was considered pretty respectable. She did her job with, quote, flair and initiative. She took care of the mail, visas, decoding messages, various kinds of things. But she wanted to get into the diplomatic service. Being a clerk was not where she wanted to end up. It didn't work out, and she was assigned to Turkey. It is shown on this map. You will see it in the northwest. It's called Izmir on this map. It was, at the time she worked there, known as Smyrna. And it was a good post. And what she found in Turkey was that she could go snipe hunting. You will see a snipe on this slide. Remember, she liked hunting. And if you look at the location of this city, of course, there were a lot of marshy areas. It was perfect for her, and she would organize these snipe hunting expeditions. Her life would change forever because of that. On December 8th, 1933, she was climbing over a wire fence to get to her favorite snipe hunting spot. She stumbled. Her long coat got caught in the wire, and when she reached out to grab it, she mistakenly fired a round into her left foot. This was a 12-gauge shotgun that was fired. She was seriously wounded. At first, the foot seemed to be healing, but then an infection set in, and eventually she had to have her leg amputated below her knee. During this ordeal, she was transferred to a hospital in Istanbul. She came down with sepsis, which I'm sure all of you know is very, very dangerous. There were thoughts that she would not survive, but she did survive. And she, ever after, had to wear a prosthetic leg. There was actually a Baltimore Son article about her. Remember, this was a prominent family, and I'm sorry it's not a better clipping, but you can see it says victim of accident in Turkey, and there is a photo of Virginia Hall. And this is a facsimile of the kind of wooden leg that she would be fitted with. She nicknamed it Cuthbert. It was 7 to 8 pounds worth of a wooden leg. Very, very awkward, not like prosthetic devices today. And as you can see, it was kept in place by this series of harness-like devices. It was extremely uncomfortable to wear, very awkward, chafed, caused sores. This is what Virginia Hall will have now for the rest of her life. She insisted on going right back to work, wooden leg and all. I mean, you cannot keep this woman down. And she was posted to Venice. Here she is in Venice. Now, as you know, in Venice, you get around by gondolas. And this is no mean trick for someone with a wooden leg that doesn't really bend. She solved the problem by buying her own gondola, and this is a photo of her in Venice. She made another effort to become a diplomat for the State Department. Her family even pulled strings and contacted an aide to President Franklin Roosevelt, but it was unsuccessful because there was an obscure rule that prohibited amputees from being diplomats. So she struck out again. She was posted now to Estonia. Here she is. It was low-grade work. It bored her. This isn't what she wanted to do. So she resigned in 1939. And of course, the war in Europe had begun, and France was in trouble. So she went to Paris in 1940, shortly before France fell, and she signed up to drive ambulances for the French army. Again, a Baltimore Son article about Virginia Hall driving an ambulance in France. And if you can read it, Miss Virginia Hall joined the Allies last February without telling her family of her intentions. She tried very hard to keep her mother in the dark about what she was doing, but lo and behold, there was an article. Now, you have to understand what she was doing here. She was driving ambulances for the French Army Health Services, and that meant that she was going into combat zones and picking up wounded soldiers and taking them to hospitals. She was determined to help her beloved France. And there are stories of, the vehicle she was driving being strafed by German planes, and the bullets are flying all around her, and there's Virginia Hall driving right through it. As I said, James Bond in a female version. This is her identification bracelet, Virginia Hall. And of course, when France fell, she was demobilized, and she was appalled at how quickly the French fell to the German onslaught and power. She decided to go to London to figure out how she could help the war effort. And this is one of those moments when a quirk of fate intervened. The way to get to London was first to go to Spain, and then to go to Portugal, and then to go to Britain. And on her way, she stopped at this little-known railroad station, Irún, which is in Spain. There, she attracted the attention of a young man. As I said, she was very striking, and he saw this woman, and she was obviously American, struck up a conversation with her, found out that she had driven ambulances in France under incredible circumstances, was impressed by her knowledge of what was happening in France, and said to her very casually, "When you get to London, you might want to look up a friend of mine," and handed her a card. Little did she know that the man she ran into, George Bellows, was a British secret agent. And the friend that he had in London was part of a new British operation. It was called the Special Operations Executive. See it at the bottom? Now, what a name, Special Operations Executive. What on earth does that mean? This was a brand new, controversial British Secret Service established by Churchill, and its purpose, sabotage, subversion, spying. It was brand new for the British. They had not done this before. It was supposed to be a new form of irregular warfare to encourage resistance against the Germans. And there was a French section. It was called Section F, of course. The name on the card was Nicholas Boddington, and she, being bored in London, called him. He invited her to a casual dinner, and he assessed her, and this is what he said. "It strikes me that this lady, a native of Baltimore, might well be used for a mission, and that we might facilitate her voyage there and back and stand her expenses on her trip in exchange for what services she could render us." Translation: we're going to make her into a spy and send her back to France. Now, there were things in her favor. She was from a neutral nation. Remember, at this point, the US hasn't entered the war. So that meant they could get her into France, not by dropping her by plane or by sea, but that she could go with a cover. She could go with a cover as a journalist for the Post. And indeed, that was going to be her cover. How could Virginia Hall resist this? She couldn't resist it. Her career so far, as she was concerned, was dead end. This promised adventure, it promised excitement, it promised danger. She would be the first woman SOE agent. So she was trained. And of course, there were obstacles. The early days of the SOE were marked by failure after failure after failure. How do you find people in France who might be willing to be part of the resistance? They didn't have a detailed plan of operation. People constantly dropped out of the training. And there were all these unanswered questions about the situation in France. And of course, there was opposition to a woman. How long would this tall woman with a limp survive? 3 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 months? They didn't think the odds were very good. This woman, Vera Atkins, who is in the French section of the SOE, will also become important as one of Virginia Hall's contacts. So she was trained, such as the training was, and in August of 1941, she went to Lisbon, and from there, she went to Vichy, France. These are the photographs taken for her passport. You can see what a striking woman she was, and very recognizable, the kind of person, if she walked into this room, you would notice her and you would remember her. How is that going to work as a spy? These are some of the passports that were issued to her during her OSS career. And here is a map of what France looked like when it was occupied by the Axis powers. Now we're talking about what was called the free zone. Look at the area in blue. And in the northern part, you will see Vichy, which is the city that Virginia Hall went to initially. She registered there as a special journalist for the New York Post. Okay. She had a wonderful instinct, and she cultivated senior Vichy officials, including the woman who was the chief censor for the foreign press in the Ministry of Information in Vichy, France. And this woman became a friend of hers and introduced her to other people. And so she ended up with about 90 contacts. She was able to collect information on German troop movements, ammunition, fuel dumps, all kinds of things. She even found out information about supposedly a secret submarine base that the Germans were building. But Vichy was not really a good place to be because there was too much of a German presence, and you can see how close it was to the German occupation zone. So in October, she moved south, goes southeast to the city of Lyon. And if you can see Lyon, it was perfect. Rivers converged. It was only 80 miles from the Swiss border, which was very good if you had to help people get to Switzerland. And it was a confusing, overbuilt city. Here's a satellite image from Google of the old city of Lyon, and you can see the density. But the thing that made Lyon particularly attractive was not only that it was a city full of resistors, but that it had passageways. It had a labyrinth of passages which had been built by silk merchants way back when. And these passageways were confusing, to say the least. In fact, if you go to Lyon today, they will give you a map of these passageways so that you can find your way through it without being lost forever. It was a city of bridges and a city of these passageways, some of which were underground. They are called triboules. Here is a courtyard and staircase in Lyon. They were perfect for hiding, for getting away, for meeting with people. The Germans could hardly find their way around this city. When she got to Lyon, Virginia Hall found that it was overcrowded with refugees, and the first place she stayed was a convent. And of course, she recruited the nuns to be part of her group. Her name in Lyon was Bridget Lecontre, and she dyed her hair. She changed her wardrobe. She went through about 20 false names, false identities. She was constantly changing her appearance. She found an ally in the American vice consul, a man named George Whittinghill, and it was a reliable way to smuggle messages to America through the consulate in Bern. She acquired an international driver's license. There it is. And she became an expert at support operations, organizing resistance and supplying agents with cash. By the way, she landed in France with millions of dollars counterfeited by the British of French francs. And she used this money to help agents. She gave them money, she organized weapons, she organized supplies, she got downed airmen to other agents who would get them to Switzerland. She was incredible. And not only did she organize people and supply information, but Virginia Hall had an instinctive intuition about being cautious. And that stood her in very good stead. Craig Gralley, an ex-CIA agent who has written a lot about her, said that part of being a good spy is being invisible. And a lot of people at that time discounted women, particularly a disabled or differently abled woman. She had a lot of courage. She had a lot of native ability. She also knew how, and this was very important, to create a spontaneous lie and how to keep her mouth shut. In many ways, being a spy was very lonely because who could you really trust? I mean, there were double agents. And as I said, Virginia Hall had that instinct, that sixth sense about certain people who she didn't trust. One of the radio operators in France had been compromised, and he went to a safe house in Marseille and called a meeting of all the other radio operators and Virginia Hall. Something told her not to go. And you have 12 radio operators for the SOE, essentially their whole operation, compromised and arrested in Marseille in October of 1941. It was a meeting she did not attend. They were very badly treated at first, but then they were transferred to this prison. It was a Vichy-run prison. The conditions were much better. So these 12 men were now being better fed and regaining strength. And Virginia Hall decided she would hatch an escape plan. And she would get these people out of prison. She worked with the wife of one of the prisoners who visited regularly and brought supplies, lots of supplies, food and books and clothing. And the guards got tired of looking through all the things. And in that can of sardines, there were little pieces of metal. And hidden in the clothes were tweezers and scissors and all kinds of things. It took several months of this plan to work, but it did work. And they escaped in July of 1942. They made a key, the prisoners made a key out of all those little bits of metal that had been hidden in sardine cans and other food, and they were able to do that. Some of the guards were bribed, and as soon as they escaped, Virginia put out the word that they had gone to a certain city where, in fact, they were staying very close to the prison and biding their time while the Germans fruitlessly looked for them. This is considered one of the most spectacular prison escapes in World War II, and Virginia Hall was responsible for it. The Germans were furious at this escape, and they flooded Vichy France with agents. They cracked down on the resistance, and Klaus Barbie, the man who's considered the butcher of Lyon for his policies and deportations of people, said, we have to capture that woman who he called the limping lady. And they put up posters. I'm sorry, I don't have a facsimile of the posters that they put up with a drawing of Virginia Hall all over. And this is the line from the Gestapo transmission. She is the most dangerous of all Allied spies. We must find and destroy her. Thus the title of my talk, The Most Dangerous Spy in World War II. The Germans in November moved to occupy Vichy France, so much for Free France, in response to the Allied invasion of North Africa, which occurred in the fall of 1942. And Virginia Hall knew the Gestapo were going to be everywhere, and it was too risky for her. She had to leave. Now, how are you going to leave Vichy France? The answer is you have to go to Spain. And how do you get to Spain from where she was? You had to go over the Pyrenees. See the Pyrenees in the north of Spain? Virginia Hall threw some clothes into a suitcase, took a train, and went to a French town very close to the Pyrenees, and then with a guide, walked for 3 days. This is November of 1942. There is snow on the mountains. She had to go 50 miles over a pass that at some points was 7,500 feet high. Craig Grally and his wife went to Spain, and they attempted to recreate her escape over the Pyrenees. And he's athletic and in very good shape. And he said it was impossible. He does not know how this woman made it. Her prosthetic wooden leg, of course, couldn't bend. Can you imagine going up and then going down? It was very, very dangerous for her. At one point, she radioed the SOE that Cuthbert was giving her problems. And the reply was, well, if Cuthbert is giving you problems, have him eliminated. They didn't realize who Cuthbert was. She made it into Spain, but because she didn't have proper papers, she found herself imprisoned for 6 weeks. And then, true to form, she smuggled a note out of the prison. The American consulate was informed, and she was released. She went back to London, and of course, what did she want to do? She wanted to go back to France and work some more. The SOE trained her as a radio operator, but she was too compromised. They weren't going to send her back, and that frustrated Virginia Hall. But she had heard that the Americans had started a new spy organization. And this spy organization, a precursor of the CIA, was called the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. She was hired in a very low rank as a second lieutenant in special operations, and she was sent back to France in March of 1944. Look at the date, March of 1944. She disguised herself as an older woman. Actually, she had her teeth ground down. She dyed her hair gray. She put on extra layers of clothing, and she transformed that limp into the arthritic hip of a French peasant farm woman. And here is her French identification certificate, of course, forged by the OSS. Her name was Marcel Martin, codenamed Diane, and she came back. And she, as a French peasant woman, she herded cows, she made cheese, she actually sold cheese in markets that were frequented by German officers. The time that she had spent at Boxhorn Farm among the animals stood her in good stead because she was perfectly comfortable posing as this French woman. Now, what was her goal? March 1944, the Allies were planning an important invasion, and her task was to recruit and arm resistance fighters. There was a French resistance group called the Marquis. She was to make contact with them. She was to arm them, to supply them, to encourage them in sabotage and guerrilla activities. You can't imagine the work she did during this time. This is the sketch of Hall done by a member of the OSS in 1944. That's without the disguise. She coordinated drops of metal tubes like this one, containing arms, ammunition, and supplies for the resistance fighters. She was sent to southern France. As you can see on this map, this is where she was posted to encourage resistance groups, and eventually ended up in Le Chambon-sur-Lyon. This would be her base. And she was now trained as a radio operator. And this is the barn where she broadcast radio transmissions. Now, broadcasting radio transmissions was one of the most dangerous things a spy could do, because the Germans rode around in trucks where they triangulated the signals. And the average life expectancy of a radio operator was 6 weeks. 6 weeks. That's how long they lasted before they were discovered. This is the Salvation Army building where Virginia lived and worked. And this painting was unveiled at a ceremony in Washington that honored Virginia Hall. This portrait is in one of the CIA's hallways. It was painted by Jeffrey Bass, and it shows her transmitting messages from France to London using her radio, which was packed in a suitcase. The radio was powered by a bicycle that was linked to electricity. And this is the kind of radio that she used. But I cannot emphasize how dangerous this was. She was able to send successfully over 3 dozen messages in a short period of time to London. This woman, Noor Kahn, for whom there was now a statue in London, was part of the SOE staff of radio operators, and she lasted from June of 1943 to October of 1943. That's all. She was captured by the Germans and eventually executed. And this was the fate of so many radio operators. So Virginia Hall was extraordinary. She worked with the French resistant, the Maquis. Now, I will tell you that at the beginning, some of the male leaders in the French resistance were very unhappy with taking suggestions from this woman. And in fact, one of the main people in this French resistance has talked about the fact that at the beginning, he couldn't stand this woman called Diane. She was bossy, she had ideas, and who was she? But by the end of the war, he credited her with amazing feats and amazing successes. And now he's become one of the people who has various testimonies to her. Her resistance circuit were successful. They were successful in destroying 4 bridges. This is one of them. They severed railroad lines. I mean, all of this was so that German troops could not go north and reinforce what was happening in northern France. They captured 500 German soldiers. They were enormously successful. This is one of the photos, rare photos of the OSS group. And pay attention to the fellow on the far right. His name was Paul Guillot, and he and Hall would actually marry in 1957 after being together for a long time. This is an undated photo of Virginia Hall and Paul when they were living in America. Obviously, this is many years later. If you can read the print on the lower left-hand part of this photo, it says the Lorna Catling Collection. This is her niece. And she has given a lot of these photographs to be used in various presentations and books about Virginia Hall. When the war was over, Virginia tried to find out what had happened to all the agents she knew. She tried to track them down. It was hard. She and Paul went to Vienna for a while, then they went back to Paris, then returned to the United States. And here she is in 1945, the only civilian woman to receive the Distinguished Service Cross from OSS Chief General Bill Donovan, September 27th, 1945. Now, Harry Truman, President Harry Truman, wanted to present it to her, and she said, oh no. She wanted a simple ceremony. She never liked publicity. She didn't like talking about herself at all. And I think that's one of the reasons that nobody really knew about her for so long. After the war, it was a natural for Virginia Hall to end up working for the CIA. Clearly, the OSS was the precursor of the CIA, and here is an aerial view of the famous CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. It was a natural transition, and she worked there for about 15 years. But it was not a happy time for her, because the CIA was a man's world, and here was this woman. She was confined to a desk. She wanted to be out in the field, doing, saving, helping. But according to fellow agents, she was constantly, quote, sidelined, undermined, belittled, unquote, by her superiors. And one man in the department called her, quote, that gung-ho old lady left over from OSS days. So what I can tell you is that her skills and knowledge were never really fully utilized by the CIA. When Gina Haspel, the first woman director of the CIA, was introduced, she talked about standing on the shoulders of heroines who never saw public acclaim. Haspel said she was indebted to women who had served the agency and the wartime predecessor, the OSS. She had to be thinking of Virginia Hall. And of course, today, the CIA now acknowledges Hall's status. There is actually a mannequin of her in the CIA Museum in Langley, Virginia, which none of us can go to, but it is there. And she is mentioned in a citation in the CIA Museum catalog. As I said, there is an acknowledgement. Some of what she did is still classified, but various people have said that at the end, the CIA utilized some of the strategies Virginia Hall had developed for setting up networks in foreign countries. She has received various honors. The Order of the British Empire Medal, presented by King George VI in 1943. She's received the Croix de Guerre from France. And in December in 2006, the French and British ambassador honored her at a ceremony in Washington, D.C. that was attended by her family. And the French president, Jacques Chirac, wrote a letter saying, quote, Hall is a true hero of the French resistance. The British ambassador presented the family with a certificate to accompany the Order of the British Empire. So she has received all these honors. And of course, we finally recognized her accomplishments. This is a photo of her on the cover of Time magazine with a story called A Perfect Spy. There is actually a historical plaque, and my family knows I love to go around the country reading historical plaques. This one was put up in Maryland. Highly effective undercover agent during World War II, declared by Gestapo the most dangerous Allied spy, grew up at Boxhorn Farm nearby. Hunting accident forced partial amputation of leg, barring her from a career in the U.S. Foreign Service. She played a significant role in the Allied victory in France while serving in extended covert activities. In 1945, received the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against the enemy. This plaque, by the way, is very close to the location of Boxhorn Farm. And of course, there have been various books. And the one that my friend had given me 3 years ago or told me about is the one on the left, A Woman of No Importance, the untold story of the American spy who helped win World War II, by Sonia Purnell. I highly recommend it. She spent 3 years doing the research. And she went through all the archives. She went to the CIA. She talked to people. She went to Europe. And it's amazing. Some of the papers are still missing. Some of the descriptions of what she did cannot be found. There are still a lot of holes in the information. There's even a movie, A Call to Spy. I believe you can watch it on Netflix. It's an interesting one. And there is a children's book about her. Virginia was a spy. A new International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. has an exhibit about her. And so the final evaluation. The man who's the executive director of this International Spy Museum has written, Hall was an extraordinarily brave woman. She was in imminent danger of being arrested virtually the whole time she was in France. And that's true. Craig Rowley, the retired CIA officer, Virginia Hall, to a certain extent, was invisible. She was able to play on the chauvinism of the Gestapo. None of the Germans early in the war necessarily thought that a woman was capable of being a spy. How true, and that worked to her advantage. And Sonia Purnell, Hall's work helped pave the way for the Allied recapture of Paris, her beloved city. So what would I say about her? I started out by saying she was astonishing, incredible, and I think those are accurate adjectives. She overcame gender discrimination. She overcame physical disability. She was fearless. She was undaunted. She was courageous. She was creative. She was a complex personality. And indeed, Virginia Hall was World War II's most dangerous spy. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to have questions.
Comments before questions?
All right, folks, especially those people on Zoom, stop multitasking and start asking Barbara some questions. This was an amazing presentation. I am sure most of you, excuse me, have never heard of this woman, and you must have some questions for Barbara. So if you do, raise your hand, and Julie will monitor the chat box and call on the people in Zoom.
Take good care of me.
Start with a question here in the Oak Room.
Barbara, what an amazing piece of research. And you are the consummate storyteller. I thoroughly enjoyed this. So much so that I'm going to get that book. Thank you very much for all that work.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Apologize for the squealing. I'm not sure where it's coming from. I was looking here first in chat. Looks like all the kudos. Kudos. Okay. Let me go back to our Oak Room here.
Thanks for the great story. It was wonderful to hear about her. Did she ever reconcile with her family and her mother who she disappointed?
Did she ever reconcile with her family was the question. Somewhat. She did come back and she did meet with her family and her aunt and her brother. And the niece remembers her, the one who has all the photos, that she came back, she looked gaunt, she looked awful, commented on these terrible clothes. But I think her mother came to accept her. And of course, the family didn't know what she had really done for a long time, because even when she came back and reconciled with the family, she didn't talk about what she had done. So they knew she had driven an ambulance. They knew she had lost her leg. They knew she was doing something overseas. She was writing articles, but they did not know for many years the extent of her activities because she didn't talk about them.
Thank you.
This was a very wonderful presentation and just shows what it is when you never give up. She faced so many obstacles, but she just continued. It just is amazing and of her life. And thank you.
You're right, Ginny. I mean, she didn't give up. I mean, when you think about her disability and what that leg was like, and there were special stockings that she had to wear under it, and if she kept going out to get them, would she attract the attention of the Germans? And the other thing is that chance meeting in this obscure railroad station in Spain. I keep thinking about that. If she hadn't met George Bellows and she had made her way to London, would she have found her way into the SOE? I don't know the answer to that. I mean, she very badly wanted to help the country she loved, France. So she would have done something, but I'm not sure that the story would have been the same. You know, they were desperate in the SOE because everything was failing. People weren't completing the training. The agents weren't being successful. And so they took a chance on this woman who spoke several languages and knew France very well. They took a chance on her. And as I mentioned to you, they did not expect her to be successful or to last as long as she did. So, yeah, definitely a determination, and also those twists of fate. You know, we've all had those moments in our life where something turns and changes forever. And that's the case with Virginia Hall, that railroad station. They should put up a plaque at the railroad station because of their chance meeting.
Barbara, thank you so much. It is so appropriate that you have been here to give us this lecture during a month of women, because Oak Hammock you are our treasure and have been. Thank you so much for your inspirational talk.
Any other questions here? Okay, coming.
Thank you, Barbara. It really was a wonderful presentation. And I was thinking while you were telling us about her, this wonderful story, it's very reminiscent of the Lillian Hellman play that has to do with Julia. Have you ever seen, Vanessa
Yes.
Redgrave and Jane Fonda are in the movie version of Julia, and Vanessa Redgrave plays a character very reminiscent of Virginia Hall with the leg and, just a really, I wonder if Lillian Hellman knew about Virginia Hall.
I don't know, but that's an excellent comparison. Yes, it is. And I'd be interested in what Pat thinks, because Pat has read a number of books on Virginia Hall.
Any speech you give is
Well,
worth coming to. And I love this. What I found very interesting, you filled in a lot about her earlier life that I didn't know, that I wasn't aware of. And one thing I really encourage everyone to read, A Woman of No Importance, because that delves a lot into her clandestine activities.
Yes, yes.
It's a marvelous book.
detail.
Yes.
In great detail, all the clandestine activities.
But I just thank you so
Oh,
much.
you're welcome. She is a fascinating woman.
Without taking away anything from Virginia Hall, I think the research that Barbara has done for this presentation today is amazing. And I don't want to even think about how much time she has spent on this. But she deserves kudos and accolades for the research she has done to put together this presentation. So Barbara, we thank you very, very much for your presentation today.
Thank you all. And if you have suggestions for other people, women that you would like me to talk about for Women's History Month, I'm always open to suggestions. I love it when people come up to me with an article or newspaper clipping. So please do. Thank you all for coming.